and learn style podcasts. So we'll have something every day of the week going on here on our channel. And we'll have something this year related to the theme of sort of an international perspective on criminal justice and homelessness. And so we've got a great guest here today that we'll jump into with that in a minute. Just a few sort of logistical notes. You can find the podcast here on our John Howard Society of PEI YouTube channel. And you can also find past podcasts and the rest of the podcast for this week. And you can find more information about that on our website or Facebook page. As always, I'm Josh Constantinou, Coordinated Access Coordinator with the John Howard Society of PEI. And today I'm joined by a fantastic guest, Iain. Iain, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Josh. Happy to be here.
Appreciate it. I know you've had countless introductions over the years. I've heard a couple of them being at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Conference this past year. I'll open it up to you, basically, how you want to introduce yourself for the folks today.
Thanks. So introducing yourself in this space is always a unique opportunity to showcase the things that you believe in, not just the things that you've done. And so as a person, I really believe that ending chronic homelessness is possible. I really believe that we need to center the work that we're doing on the strengths of individuals and help individuals achieve their desires and goals. So very much a person-centered practitioner. I've been in the field going on 3 decades now in different roles, from direct service to policy work to consulting. I have had the great pleasure of working for nonprofits and government in the private sector and hold leadership positions within that. And then I also happen to be the president and CEO of OrgCode Consulting. I'm the author of the book on ending homelessness. I'm the founder of the Leadership Academy on ending homelessness. I do a fair amount of keynote speaking and conference speaking and media commentary on homelessness. And I'm just a passionate advocate for working with communities and organizations that share my passion for making homelessness rare, and if it does occur, brief and one time.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Iain. I appreciate it. And certainly I can say personally connect with a lot of the values that you hold, which is why it's been great to be a part of some of the work that OrgCode does and to be part of some of the talks that you've put on and videos that you've shared there on your YouTube channel. Okay, so I guess to give a bit of context to folks, some of the work you've done typically, I guess, through OrgCode has occurred in other countries, including the United States and Australia. And so as part of our theme here on international perspectives, we wanted to get a little bit of insight and background and sort of opportunity for you to share your experience when it comes to the intersection between criminal justice and homelessness, which seems to be an increasingly relevant topic to talk about, based both on some of the decision-making, policy creating, and just general approach to homelessness individuals. So I'll kind of open it up to you if there's anything you want to add to that context, and then sort of jumping in with how do you see, or what's your experience been with other countries and their approach to homelessness and hopefully our shared journey of trying to end chronic homelessness and homelessness.
So I think the juncture that we're in as a sector is really interesting, in as much as for a period of time, homelessness was seen as a housing and support issue, right? It's not to say that there weren't some organizations or political leaders who wanted to go very much down the road of forced and voluntary treatment and those sorts of things. But predominantly it was seen as a housing issue. And in recent times, that has shifted. It has shifted perhaps more so in the last 8 years than it has any other time. And more acutely, I would say, probably in the last 6 years. If we look at the kind of pre-pandemic, into pandemic, and kind of post-pandemic reality, what we've ended up in a space where homelessness has grown, as I'm sure you and your listeners have encountered. As homelessness has grown, frustration has grown. And as frustration has grown, people are looking for solutions. And the solution that people tend to gravitate towards, is seen as a silver bullet, is let's have police deal with this, and let's have police deal with this as a criminal justice issue as opposed to a housing issue. How does this kind of manifest itself? Well, it is predominantly an effort to criminalize unsheltered homelessness. That's the first part, right? So there's not this big movement towards anti-shelter. In fact, there's a lot of pro-shelter movement in the criminal justice space around creating more spaces so people who are unsheltered are not swept up within criminal justice activities related to their unsheltered homelessness. And it does not pertain as much to hidden homelessness, people who are couch surfing, doubled up with a friend, that sort of thing. So really, it's the visibility of homelessness that has caught the ire and the attention of decision makers on what do we do with this issue. And I think it's become a lot easier from a political level to say that the issue that we are confronted with today is the fault of people, not the fault of systems. As opposed to saying people are in the situation that they're in because we have not invested sufficiently in housing. We have not invested sufficiently in income supports and government assistance. We have not invested sufficiently in voluntary mental health supports, including substance use disorder support. We have not invested sufficiently in permanent supportive housing. So rather than looking at our policy failures, what we see to justify the criminal justice approach is faulting individuals for having the experience of their homelessness. Now let's look at how this kind of manifests itself in the United States and Australia. I'm going to start with Australia because it's still fairly in the infancy stages there, but certainly Australia, for most of its history, has had rough sleeping, which is mainly been impacting Indigenous people in Australia, some of whom would not consider themselves to be homeless in the pursuit of accessing resources and services away from their home community in a more urban environment. But we are seeing local councils throughout parts of Australia work towards criminalizing aspects of rough sleeping or unsheltered homelessness in their community. So a strong move towards sweeps, bans, trying to justify that rough sleeping is really antithetical to the investment that's been made in the homelessness services realm in Australia, and that there really is a desire, I think, to make sure that they don't see the visible manifestation of homelessness as we might see in parts of Canada and the United States. More troubling at this point, though, Josh, is what we're seeing in the United States and the criminalization of homelessness. And even pre the Grants Pass Supreme Court decision of last year, which, if your listeners are unaware, was a court case that pertained to Grants Pass, Oregon, and whether or not the municipality had the right to fine people experiencing homelessness for sleeping outside, and if they, by extension, if they couldn't pay their fines, if they could be incarcerated. So it went through different circuit courts in the United States and ends up at the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court essentially says, and this is my read on it, it's okay to criminalize homelessness. It is entirely within a municipality's right to impose fines upon people who are experiencing homelessness, and that this is justifiable given that, well, the people could pull themselves up by their bootstraps and they're not, right? So it's not like the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So we might see it applied to other vulnerable populations. It's essentially saying, my read, that homelessness is a choice that people are making, and therefore choices have consequences, and the consequence is going to be criminalization. So what does this mean? It means that it becomes permissive for municipalities throughout the United States to engage in more anti-encampment services. So not necessarily winding down encampments with a housing-focused lens and making sure services are exhausted, but the ability to engage in sweeps. And we see this also finding its way into how tickets are issued for things like sleeping outside or having a tent or where people are located. And the escalating fines, of course, people experiencing poverty cannot afford, and therefore they end up in a space of incarceration.
Right.
What this means from a practitioner perspective is that street outreach services, for example, are now operating within this environment of urgency that if they can't find solutions for people fast enough, they feel concerned that people will be swept up into these basically poverty traps, right? Incarcerating you because you don't have belongings or enough money. So there's a fear there. There's pressure across municipalities. So California is one of the jurisdictions where I do a fair amount of work. And even within the same county, you could have two municipalities that actually have borders onto each other. One of them is taking the criminalization route, the other one is taking the service route. And the one that's taking the service route is essentially looking back and saying, hey, if they're criminalizing it next door, isn't everybody just going to come to our municipality? And do we have enough resources to be able to take that on? So you might see some municipalities saying, we're not anti-criminalization, but we are going to become pro local connections, right? Have you ever had housing here? Have you ever lived here? As opposed to, did you come here in a transient way, shape, or form? In which case we might deem you to be ineligible for services. We may not use a criminal justice approach, but it still has negative consequences on people's wellness and the ability to not only live, but thrive.
Right.
So we're challenged right now, Josh. We're really challenged in the rhetoric. We're challenged in the implementation, and we're challenged in terms of the values that we hold for people experiencing homelessness and whether or not we see it as the fault of the individual or the fault of systems.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, that's been the biggest shift, is that somewhere down the line, the onus has become on the person to navigate this extremely difficult situation versus trying to support people through these challenges.
I think you're absolutely right. And I also think that the challenge in that is that the otherizing of people becomes permissible, almost encouraged, right? That people are seen as less than as opposed to equal to. And I think that allows people to justify actions that perhaps are not going to get the most appropriate results for the people that they're aiming to serve.
Right, which further isolates the people that are already disconnected from certain services and resources.
And I'm already seeing some of that. I mean, some of the jurisdictions that I work post Grant's past decision in the Supreme Court, when you're out with outreach teams, people are less visible. They are in more nooks and crannies and out of the way places. They're trying to avoid detection,
Right.
which makes the process of developing trust between outreach worker and person in need of assistance that much harder. Because if I don't have trust developed and you're an outreach worker, how do I know that you're not going to rat out my location to the police? And you can provide all the word assurances you want, but seeing is believing. And I think there's a lot of people experiencing homelessness, especially chronic homelessness, who are worried that they will be outed and that there will be negative repercussions for that.
Right.
And on the municipal side of things, I mean, just one more thing to add there, it used to be that you could just walk through the economics of homelessness and be really clear that incarceration is not an appropriate use of resources compared to alternatives, right? Supportive housing with ongoing 24/7 supports is considerably more affordable than incarceration with far fewer supports. And that argument used to work, but now I think that there's a bit of a kind of cultural value shifting and saying, I don't care what it costs. Let's just put this into place so that I don't have to look at homelessness anymore. And we see the translation of that happening a little bit north of the border as well. If we look at what's happening in places like Ontario, Safer Municipalities Act was part of the Conservatives platform in the most recent provincial election, something that they brought up and thought that they were putting on pause before the election. They brought it back. But this is essentially a response to about a dozen mayors across Ontario writing to the premier and saying that they wanted the notwithstanding clause put in place to force people into involuntary treatment and other consequences for homelessness. And what did those mayors cite as a good piece of policy to follow? Grant's past Supreme Court decision in the United States. So even though it happens in the United States, it's not staying in the United States. Even though our justice systems are completely different, there's political leaders who are looking at what's happening south of the border and find that that actually is something that they want to explore within a Canadian context, which I think is scary, to be honest.
Yeah, particularly when their ideology is going to align with leadership in the States, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's That's been a real challenge. We've seen that locally here too, around the disbursement of people, where when we try to sort of hotspot map encampments, there's really not much encampment going on anymore. It's really like scattered homelessness across various different sites, like you said, to try to avoid the policing aspect of it, or the being captured or swept away, as you put. So as we start to look at kind of how they're approaching it, and what the impact has been, I guess, where do you see this kind of trending as it continues to go in the direction that it is right now?
I think the trend is going to be towards more criminalization, not less.
Right.
I think that, in the American context, in particular, we even see states that otherwise would have been declared left-leaning or more liberal, moving towards anti-encampment ordinances. That it's not just an issue of like conservative versus liberal anymore in the U.S. context. So I see the trajectory becoming that it becomes permissive and almost expected of elected officials that they'll handle homelessness in this way. And in the Canadian context, in terms of how this comes across and what this is actually going to mean, I think it will be a bit of a careful watch of what's happening in the United States. But I think that um, the investment in encampment resolution funding that's happening throughout the country, as well as some of the work that we're doing with municipalities on encampments, people are looking for quick fixes to complex community and social dynamics. And those things don't actually fit. And I think where people rely upon law enforcement, they say that or think that it will be a quick resolution, but it's actually going to be much more expensive and can make people's lives much worse over the long term, as I'm sure you and your colleagues at John Howard know particularly well.
Yeah, and I think you've hit on one of the bigger challenges, is that there's sort of a misunderstood argument of, well, we've kind of, from folks that would support the kind of criminal justice approach that you're talking about, of anti-encampment, anti-unsheltered homelessness, where the thought is like, well, we tried it your way for a long time and homelessness got worse.
Yeah, well, let's pick up on that thread because I think that's a really good one. That we tried your approach. So one of the things that we can point to in the United States is that in the 2010s, we did see a 5 or 6 year period where we saw overall declines in homelessness. And so we have that as a proof point. In the United States, we continue to see veterans homelessness decline, or homelessness amongst veterans, people who have served in the American armed forces. And so we have these proof points that when resourced appropriately and when there's enough housing available, that we get good traction, right? So we have those proof points. But I think what people are looking at more has been the increase since the pandemic, and wondering, well, why couldn't you, our sector, get your stuff together to respond more effectively? You failed us. And we can probably scream from the rooftops, we weren't resourced enough and we didn't have enough housing. And oh, by the way, the workforce got decimated during the pandemic in homelessness services. But that's falling on deaf ears, right? So that kind of, trust us, we know what we're doing, and we've just been on a kind of a rough patch, I don't think is resonating with the general public, which is why we see this pendulum swing towards criminal justice. And in that part, I mean, we should also talk about law enforcement themselves. Certainly a number of the beat cops and sheriff's office employees I've talked to in the United States, they don't want to be spending all day every day dealing with homelessness. That isn't why they got into law enforcement. So it's not like the enforcement arm of the criminal justice response is met with an enthusiastic audience that wants to engage in that way. I think there's a lot in law enforcement. It's like, can we let social workers do social work stuff and police officers do police stuff? Because there isn't that quick fix from the social work perspective, they want criminalization.
Yeah, the people in power are running out of patience, and it continues to look poorly or reflect poorly on them as leaders when the situation continues to get worse.
And in some of these jurisdictions, whether they be Canadian, Australian, or American, I also, because I can be a bit of a provocative person, when asked, or when I had the audience with elected officials, I asked how much the police budget has increased over the same period of time, and how much the services for homeless individuals and housing stabilization services has increased over the same time. And they're not putting together that the absence of investment in homeless services and housing stability is really what's driving a lot of the desire to have more investment in police. Maybe if we took some of that investment and put it towards proof points, put it towards evidence-based practices, we'd see a different result.
Right. Yeah, like you alluded to, the funding and resources needs to be there. The great work that the frontline individuals do can only go so far without resources to back that up.
Well, and on that front, right? I mean, let's look at the shelter side of this, because it is predominantly an unsheltered issue. But if we have shelters that can't afford to operate 24 hours a day, there's going to be people outside. Those people outside are going to have more law enforcement engagement and potential criminalization of their homelessness. Or we see some shelters in some jurisdictions that are not lower barrier, that have all sorts of hoops for people to jump through that they just can't. And so sometimes we manufacture the conditions that are putting people at risk. And so I do think part of this equation does require looking at our system as a whole, and saying, have we done all of our due diligence to make sure that our services are as accessible as possible to people who would otherwise be swept up in under the guise of compassionate care, which is couched within criminal justice.
Right. So if those law officers or enforcement individuals said, we don't want to fine you or charge you or criminalize you, let me take you to a shelter or other alternative, those alternatives need to exist if hypothetically they were willing to even go down that road.
That's right. They need to exist, one, with sufficient capacity, two, in a way that's accessible, three, and that they're actually open. And I don't think that the public generally appreciates the homelessness sector has been asked to do more with less, even more so once the pandemic funding ran out. Right? It's like, yeah, we gave you this money to do with the kind of gearing up of temporary responses during the pandemic, but there was no post-pandemic strategic investment. It was more of a winding down. And so a lot of budgets have returned back to the normal size with an influx of homelessness that they just can't meet the demand. And so I don't think the issue is really one of ineffectiveness of homelessness response is what's leading to criminal justice en masse. I think it's one of under-resourced homelessness response en masse is leading to an ineffectiveness to meet people's needs, which leads to the proliferation of encampments, which leads to frustration to the point where people are apoplectic, which leads to a criminal justice response.
Right. And when you talk about resources and resource management, do you think there's anything either, locally or south of the border or in Australia that could be done to sort of optimize or maximize the resources that we do have in this sector?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, I listen, let's welcome and applaud the federal government for putting some money into encampments and the provinces and territories that have matched that funding to make a difference in their communities, right? Like that is a step on those two orders of government, which trickles down to the local level, which I think has value. And if we have time to fully implement that before going further ahead with criminal justice initiatives, I think that would be best. So
Right.
let's give credit where credit is due
For sure.
on that front. But those resources are not necessarily full system resources, right? They're more like encampment response shelter capacity resources. They're not necessarily getting at other big issues around supports and supportive housing on scale and those sorts of things that we know are necessary. They're not generating interministerial councils within provinces or territories to like make sure that the criminal justice ministry is working well with the health ministry that's working well with the social service ministry or whatever they're called at the provincial territory level. So we're not seeing system change. We're seeing investment that may not get the full results as that are envisioned if they're not done strategically. So, but I'd still give credit for putting more additional resources into it. But I think at the individual operator level, the individual service provider level, they're going to be faced, I think, with new ultimatums probably within a few years in the American context, which is you either get on board with our criminal justice agenda or you're not funded anymore. I think that's probably the direction it's going to go. I also think that in the U.S., the movement towards criminal justice is in part not just incarceration in jails and prisons, predominantly jails, but it will be uh, moving towards what I've sometimes referred to as therapeutic incarceration, which is I will force you to go to our facility. And that facility, they may call it a shelter, it might just be a glorified internment camp, but it'll be impermissible for you to sleep outside. So you have to sleep on this property or in this building. And if you do that in return for your services, you also have to see a psychiatrist, take your medications, work on sobriety, have workforce participation, usually in some, I'd say broader project. And I think that kind of control that's going to be put on people is going to strip away autonomy. And I think it'll be an untenable position for a lot of service providers to say, how do I remain trauma informed and person centered and strengths based within a changing system that actually wants me to be system centered, that doesn't want me to be trauma informed, actually wants me to be trauma inflicting, and is so deficit based that it will not get the personal results of change that I think they're aspiring to. And the other thing that's not answered in any of this, Josh, is if we go towards that route of therapeutic incarceration, let's say I did, put in my time, I worked on my sobriety, I attended life skills classes, I demonstrated to you I was awesome at budgeting. Where am I supposed to go next? Because we're not investing in housing at scale at the same time and not investing in supports to keep people housed at the same time. You can create all the emergency spaces you want, but you won't have throughput. And then you'll just have disaster after disaster after disaster. The example that I often use is to say it's like opening up a bunch more emergency departments, but forgetting to build the rest of the hospital. Yeah, we need good emergency departments. We also need longer term care. We also need, a whole range of other supports that people have. We have to invest in the what's next, not just in the crisis in the moment. We need strategic intent, not just a crisis bias.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to that ability to think beyond the present moment and to have a little bit more foresight to see, like you alluded to, this is a complex issue. And so just throwing a Band-Aid situation at it of involuntarily putting people in spaces in residential environments and then wondering what'll happen down the line, it's going to lead to more problems. And so you really do have to have that long-term vision and that strategic thinking.
And I think we need to acknowledge that the language that's being used to frame this is language that is really coming from our sector, but is spun in a different way. So a lot of this is described as compassionate. And the roots of the word compassion mean to suffer with, not to make a person suffer. And I think we forget that. I think that, in the space of compassion, for communities that say, well, what about the person with serious and persistent mental illness who doesn't seem to be voluntarily participating in care? As far as I know, and I could be wrong on this, but I think just about every provincial and territorial jurisdiction in the country, if not every single one, already has some sort of law in place for involuntary treatment related to mental health if someone is not doing well. Doesn't mean it works well. Doesn't mean that it's always applied fairly. Doesn't mean that it's always got great results with like the police interaction with people. But I think that exists. So maybe we need to improve upon existing processes and make them better and more related to the population served than going in a completely different approach that is probably more draconian and certainly more expensive.
Right. Yeah, and you see, if you wanted to kind of refer to that as like somebody goes into a mental health situation where involuntarily they're placed and then they come out, and what is sort of, if you borrow from the correction terms, like the rate of recidivism of people going back in because they weren't properly managed or supported afterwards, that could kind of mirror what might happen with that involuntarily homeless approach.
Totally agree with you. And I think that idea of recidivism, even that is often seen as a personal failure for something that didn't work, as opposed to what did the system not do to support you to be successful, right? We often come back to it's the fault of the person, when I actually think certainly there's some of that, but a large part of it is actually the fault of systems. It is broken people in broken systems trying to achieve results that are sometimes beyond what either are capable of doing.
Yeah, there's a differentiation between responsibility versus blame.
Yes, true.
So in terms of kind of, you've talked a bit about like the impact that might be coming here from some of this. Is there anything that, because I don't want to completely paint this as a negative brush, despite, the reality is what it is, but is there anything that's going on in the United States or Australia that you've observed and thought, hey, that's something that in Canada we might be able to try here or use here in the way that we deal with homeless individuals, or that intersection between criminal justice and homelessness?
In terms of innovations, I don't know if there's much, particularly in the criminal justice space specific. I mean, certainly there's some things that are replicable or comparable in the Canadian context, like diversion courts. Some U.S. jurisdictions have homeless courts or veterans homeless courts, specifically to assist in more kind of quality of life type deemed infractions, usually without an emphasis on incarceration. So, but we know what diversion is like. We have different diversion programs in this country. I think that the um, desire on the part of some programs to help with reentry, we have that in the Canadian context. I think that is just starting to expand more in the United States context in terms of how do we support people upon exit from incarceration. I
Hmm.
think that holds promise. Um, Certainly, there's a number of Canadian jurisdictions and an increasing number of U.S. jurisdictions that are seeing the value of identification banks or safe storage for ID, so that when people are going in and out of incarceration and onto the streets and into the shelter and then on their friend's couch or whatever, that at least their birth certificate and maybe their social and other government issue ID is safely stored while all that's going on, as opposed to lost and repeatedly having to replenish it. Um, and the other thing that I think, a takeaway from the U.S. In this context is the importance of rapid rehousing.
Hmm.
Uh, that not everybody is going to need permanent supportive housing. Not everybody is going to need a recovery-oriented, housing-focused intensive case management or served community treatment approach. So, how do we help some of those individuals that don't necessarily have the same depth of need and just need rapid access to housing? I think that's something that is invested in a scale in the U.S. that we could probably see some better results if we saw comparable investment proportional to the population, of course, in the Canadian context.
Right. I'll jump onto that for a sec. I'll sidebar for 1 minute because you mentioned the ID clinic, and that was something that brought up at the conference in Ottawa. And so we actually brought that back here locally to have discussions about how we can do that and incorporate potentially support from the Law Foundation around notarizing IDs to have that available for people.
It's just such an awesome part of the system of care. I mean, there's so many frontline staff who are so dedicated and so mission driven, and those so frustrated by the bureaucracy that they have no control over. And I just think it's an opportunity to decrease some of the frustration associated with bureaucracy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and the population of folks that we're referring to, it's so difficult for them to keep track of their life on a day-to-day basis that expecting them to maintain their ID is it's a real challenge.
Sure is.
So the rapid rehousing, I think that's interesting to touch on. I feel like that became a hot topic several years ago and then somewhat faded, at least from my kind of what I heard going through, permeating through sort of interests and things. But it sounds like, based on the direction that things are going, where getting unsheltered individuals off the street is going to be a priority within the criminal justice system, that rapid rehousing, while not necessarily suitable to all individuals, particularly the more complex folks that might be experiencing unsheltered homelessness, it might pair well with the criminal justice approach of getting people housed as quickly as possible.
Well, I definitely think there's wins there potentially. I think there's two big ones. One, if we truly have a rapid rehousing framework that is really diligent at staying action focused, I can certainly see a bit more upstream. Again, not so much on jail, but certainly upon prison release, when we have a better sense of when people are exiting, that we probably could do a better job connecting people to housing rapidly.
Mm.
And some of that could actually happen pre-release, I think, in a way that might make sense. Um, for those that have already exited and are back into experiencing homelessness, I also think that we look at where they're at relative to their needs And if their need is predominantly an affordability one, rapid rehousing does a really good job at providing access to accommodation in a way that's affordable for a period of time as they work on increasing their income. And we don't have a lot of mechanisms in the Canadian context for housing people with zero income. Most jurisdictions, if we're relying upon private landlords, want some proof of income, whether that's government assistance or employment. Even some or a lot of permanent supportive housing providers with rent geared to income want people to have some form of income. At least with rapid rehousing, we would have the ability to house people with no income and then figure out the income after the fact. And I think that would be a benefit.
That's a great point. And, we did our point in time count there in October. And I've, been going through some of that data more recently. And certainly when we're asking people about, what are the barriers or what led to eviction or what led to loss of housing, the affordability and lack of income and high cost of rent just keeps popping up and popping up and popping up. And not that that's a surprise, but I think that is just another sort of feedback loop that reinforces what you're saying around the challenge of people with low or no income.
Yeah, and I think one of the studies that was recently done, the Benioff Housing and Homelessness work out of the University of California in San Francisco, did the largest study on engaging with people experiencing homelessness, I think, since the 70s, and it just came out last year.
Wow.
And or the core findings came out last year, and one of the key takeaways for me was, they do these thousands of interviews, and I forget what the exact figure is, Josh, but for this huge percentage of people, the difference between their homelessness and not their homelessness was a few $100. Like, they're going to consume more resources and expenses being homeless than they would have been if we found a way to intervene with a few $100 when times got tight. And I think that we can't lose sight of the fact that if we're going to talk about keeping people out of the way of criminal justice activities that are criminalizing homelessness, keeping people housed and preventing their homelessness is actually a really good way to avoid law enforcement engagement. And if it does mean, putting a few $100 towards someone, even if it was for 6 or 12 months of assistance while we figure out how to help them increase their income in other ways, I would much rather be doing that as a society and keep people housed as we figure out the pathway forward than having people descend into homelessness, lose everything, and then we're starting from scratch.
Definitely. And like you said, there's a ton of research to show that once somebody enters into homelessness, it's a lot harder to get them housed than it is if you can prevent that from ever happening.
Well, it becomes this black hole, right? It just wants to suck you deeper and deeper and deeper. And the amount of energy you need to escape homelessness once you're into it, I would argue, is far greater than the amount of energy it takes to stay out of it. And the whole energy to get out of homelessness is also more of a marathon, whereas I think the prevention activity is more of like a middle distance sort of approach. So just really looking at where we put resources to support people's well-being. If where they were staying was safe and appropriate, let's have them stay in safe and appropriate places.
Yeah, and it kind of is like the next tier. If you think of like the more long-term permanent supportive case management that we referenced earlier, and then the rapid rehousing, and then prevention is at the top of that in terms of interventions that require typically less resources, certainly less worker resources, and probably less financially.
I agreed on that for sure. I think the resource piece, especially, I mean, if that's another thing we could take away from the US right now, even more so than the Australian context. But in the American example, if we look at what's happening at the federal level, so much is being labeled as fraud, waste, and abuse. That there's this desire to make sure government resources are used efficiently and effectively. The methodology that's being applied, I would say, is more harmful than helpful. But I do think that in the space of responding to homelessness, we can't lose sight of the fact that we are an under-resourced, efficient system. If we had considerably more resources, if we actually had waste, then I think we'd probably be open to scrutiny, or are we investing in the right things? But my experience in our country, Josh, is that almost every organization and community is trying to do the best work they can with the resources they've got. And the only way that we're going to get improvements to avoid and thwart criminalization is to invest in scale of both interim and permanent solutions.
Right. Yeah, you need that long-term piece built for people.
Well, I mean, would we rather be spending tens of thousands of dollars a year on incarceration, or tens of thousands supporting people to stay housed so they have no criminal involvement? I choose the latter, but those are my values, and they'd have to be shared values amongst Canadians if we're going to move the policy and the program needle to continue to reinforce that.
Yeah, and the political leaders have to buy into that.
Well, they do, and I mean, from the political perspective, why do we have this push towards criminalizations? Because of their constituencies, right? Their constituents are the ones saying, "I'm sick of seeing homelessness in my park or in my beach or along my riverbank or along my trail." Like, it just keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. And I think elected officials are like, "Okay, well, we talked to the nonprofits and they're tapped out. They can't do any more." Or they erroneously think that we've been doing the wrong things, like focusing on housing and supporting people rather than warehousing people. But so much of that is coming, like, we don't advocate and communicate with our elected officials in the way that people who call the complaint do. Uh, and if we want to do a better job as a sector in thwarting criminalization US style from becoming more imprinted in the Canadian context, we have to do a better job at having a common narrative, a common story, common key messages with elected officials to let them know we know what works. We also know we don't have the money to do what works. So either you give us the money to do what works, or you're going to spend more money in criminalizing homelessness.
Right. Yeah, and that advocacy piece is so important. Yet, I think if you were to sort of survey the strengths of people, they're good at advocating for their clients and their needs, but I'm not sure they're great at navigating the political system and how that works in terms of advocacy and things like that.
Well, totally agree. And I think, generally speaking, we're not in a lobbyist type industry.
No.
We focus more on relationships and are a lot more reactionary as opposed to proactive. It's also why I really applaud the work that you are doing with your John Howard to have this podcast and to promote information outside of other media spheres. Because I think if we are going to change the message, it's not going to come from the tried and true methods. We have to have different ways of speaking to audiences that are only consuming their news now on YouTube, or only consuming their news now through other online sources. So we have to speak to where people are consuming knowledge, not just sticking to the ways that we might have historically done, like putting out a white paper or trying to get an op-ed or those sorts of things. If we want to influence our elected officials, we have to get to their constituencies in a different way. And I think the online medium, the social medium, is a way to go.
I agree. Thank you for that. And yeah, I think we have to evolve and adapt and become innovative as things change. I know we are reaching sort of the end of our time here, and I want to be mindful of that. As we kind of move towards wrapping up, is there anything that we haven't covered that you feel would be beneficial to share or to provide to myself and the listeners?
I would say one point, which is we need to look at homelessness through a lens of human rights. And we often look at it through a lens of nuisance. Every single person that we work with needs somewhere to live, something to do, and someone to love, and are deserving of that for the mere nature that they exist. People don't need to justify their existence to get out of homelessness. People don't need to see housing as a reward. And my fear is that if we go down the criminal justice route in a way that is being kind of put forward in the likes of the United States, that will increasingly see deserving and undeserving poor, which is really who we believe has rights and who doesn't have rights. And I would think that it's completely unacceptable to us as Canadians to strip away people's rights because we don't like seeing people in parks. There's another solution. It's housing and supports. Let's bring it to scale, and let's decrease criminal involvement and law enforcement involvement with people experiencing homelessness, not increase it. And I think that's the pathway to where the community-based sector needs to be really lending their voice. And I think that we'll be much better off if we stay true to knowing what works, as opposed to deviating from those paths just because people are reached a frustration point with homelessness.
For sure. Appreciate that. Thanks, Iain. Well, we appreciate you coming on. It's been a great opportunity to have a discussion with you here about this. I'm sure the listeners got some great points to take away from it. We will move towards the John Howard wrap up, but before I wrap up kind of what we're up to the rest of the week, do you want to share anything about where people can find you or what you're up to?
Yeah, certainly you can find more on our website, orgcode.com. That's orgcode.com. You can also find a lot of information on homelessness commentary and some micro trainings on the YouTube channel, which is at Iain De Jong, so at IAINDEJONG. You can also find me on Instagram, the same approach, and certainly encourage anybody who found this interesting to follow me on LinkedIn, where I also put usually weekly some sort of comment, fact, report, piece of interest relative to homelessness. And just a big thanks to you, Josh and John Howard, for the good work that you're doing in putting together these podcasts and share this information. And also just a big thank you to John Howard chapters throughout the country who continue to center people with a history of involvement with incarceration and law enforcement, and seeing the worthiness of people in housing and supporting them upon their exit. So thanks to you, and thanks to the work of John Howard.
Thanks, Iain. We really appreciate that. We're certainly proud of the progress we're making and recognize there's always more to do. So we're excited to keep chipping away. You can find this podcast and the next one, which will be tomorrow. We'll feature the John Howard Canada podcast, same on Wednesday, and then on Thursday we'll be back with another guest here. You can find all our stuff here on the John Howard Society of YouTube channel, Facebook, or our website, johnhowardsocietypei.com. Thanks again to everybody tuning in. Thanks again to Iain for joining us, and we look forward to our next podcast. Thanks, Iain.